She asked for water. The flight attendant looked her up and down, then skipped her on purpose. No one said a word until the pilot came out mid-flight. What happened next changed the entire cabin. And by the time they landed, the airline wasn't the only one under pressure. Before we start the story, comment below where you're watching from today. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss a new story. The boarding area buzzed with the usual noise of rolling suitcases and short announcements over the loudspeaker. 16-year-old Nia Chandler stood quietly by the window, clutching her boarding pass with both hands. Her gray hoodie had a small university logo on it, gifted by her aunt last Christmas. She wore clean jeans and white sneakers, the laces tied in double knots like her dad always reminded her to do. It was her first time flying alone. The thought made her a little nervous, but she kept her face calm. Her dad had hugged her tight at the gate and reminded her to stay sharp, stay kind, and text if anything felt wrong. She nodded and promised she would. When the gate agent called her group, Nia moved forward with the small line. Most people gave her polite space, though one woman in a long trench coat cut in front of her without a glance. Nia didn't say anything. She just stepped back and waited her turn. When she finally entered the plane, the air smelled like coffee and plastic seat leather. A middle-aged flight attendant with short blonde hair and red lipstick stood near the entrance, greeting each passenger with a mechanical smile. When Nia reached her, the woman didn't smile. She only glanced down at the girl's boarding pass and said flatly, "Left side, but I think you're in the wrong section." Nia looked at the number printed on the card. "Seat 2A, she said, unsure. The woman raised an eyebrow. "That's business class, sweetheart," she said, pointing ahead. "You must mean 12A. Coach is further back." Her tone wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough for the nearby passengers to hear. Nia felt her face warm. She didn't argue. She simply opened the boarding pass and turned it toward the woman. The number 2A was clear. So was her name. The flight attendant paused, then forced a smile. "Oh, all right then," she said. "Go ahead." Her eyes didn't soften. Nia moved past her, clutching her small bag a little tighter. As she settled into her seat by the window, she noticed the man across the aisle glancing her way, then quickly looking back at his newspaper. No one said anything, but the silence around her had changed. Nia sat straight, looking out the window as people filled in around her. She didn't touch the call button. She didn't speak. Her throat felt tight, but her hands stayed still. Something in her told her not to react. Not yet. The seats around Nia slowly filled with the low rustle of boarding passengers and the shuffle of overhead bins. A man in a gray blazer took the seat next to her, offering a small nod and nothing more. Nia nodded back, keeping her voice tucked away. She pulled her phone from her pocket and tapped out a quick message to her dad. "Boarded. In seat. Fine so far." She left out the part about the flight attendant. It didn't seem important enough to mention, or maybe she just didn't want to sound dramatic. A few rows ahead, the same flight attendant walked briskly through the aisle with a service tray. Her badge read Cheryl. She moved with the confidence of someone who had done the job for years. Straight posture, clipped steps, smile reserved only for certain passengers. Nia watched quietly as Cheryl stopped to offer drinks to the man in seat 1C, then to a woman with a sleek handbag in 1A. When she reached Nia's row, her hand paused over the tray. Cheryl's eyes flicked to Nia, then to the man next to her. She leaned in slightly toward him. "Would you like anything to drink before takeoff?" she asked, her voice light. The man looked surprised, but said, "Sure, just water's fine." Nia waited for her turn, but Cheryl was already moving on. She didn't ask Nia, not even a glance. Nia blinked, unsure if she should say something. Her voice came out soft but clear. "Excuse me, can I get some water too?" Cheryl turned around with a tight smile. "Service is for business class passengers only before takeoff, hon. I am in business class," Nia said, more confused than angry. Cheryl looked at her again, as if seeing her for the first time, then turned away. We'll begin full service after we're in the air." The man next to Nia raised an eyebrow, glancing at her, then back at Cheryl, but he said nothing. Cheryl moved back up the aisle. Nia sat quietly, her hands still in her lap. She felt her skin heat up, not from anger, but from that kind of embarrassment that makes you feel small in public, even when you've done nothing wrong. A few rows ahead, a younger flight attendant, her name tag read Riley, glanced back from the galley and caught the scene. Her eyes landed on Nia for just a second longer than necessary. Then she turned and continued her tasks. Nothing was said. But something had shifted. Again. The plane door sealed with a soft hiss and the pilot's voice came over the speaker, welcoming passengers and announcing a smooth flight ahead. Nia barely listened. Her ears were still ringing from what had just happened, not because the words were loud, but because they stayed in her head. Cheryl's voice echoed there. "We'll begin full service after we're in the air." The way she'd said "Han" had sliced right through her, not kind, not casual, but like a lid being screwed tight on something not meant to be opened. She kept her eyes on the seat back in front of her, pretending to be focused on the safety card, but her chest felt tight. The man next to her cleared his throat softly. Nia didn't look at him. She didn't want to see pity. She didn't want to explain anything. Not here. Not now. The plane began to taxi, and Nia pressed her knees together, her fingers tightening around the hem of her hoodie. She felt eyes occasionally flick toward her from across the aisle. Small, passing glances, the kind people give when something feels off, but no one wants to be the first to say it out loud. She could feel them, and she knew exactly what they were thinking. What's a girl like her doing in this section? She turned her head slightly, just enough to look back toward the galley. Cheryl was there, laughing with another crew member, pouring water into glasses lined neatly on a tray. Her smile was easy now, natural. Nia watched how it came alive for others, how it was completely absent when she stood in front of her. She wasn't being loud or rude or demanding. All she did was ask for water. Across from her, an older woman in a scarf whispered something to her husband. They both glanced at Nia. The husband gave a small shrug, almost like he didn't want to be involved. The woman's expression tightened, as if she had seen enough to know something wasn't right. Nia looked down at her phone and slowly typed a message. "Still in seat. Just tired. We'll text when we land." She hesitated before sending it. Then she backspaced the word "tired" and replaced it with "all good." It wasn't a lie, not exactly. It was just simpler. She slid the phone into her hoodie pocket and leaned her head back. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane picked up speed. Nia closed her eyes, but her thoughts stayed loud. She wasn't angry yet, just tired in a different way. The kind of tired that doesn't come from traveling, but from always needing to prove something quietly, over and over again in places where she was just trying to exist. As the plane lifted off the runway, she opened her eyes slowly and stared out the window. A cloud moved past, soft and silent. Everything outside was calm, but inside something small had already started to shift. The seatbelt sign dinged off and a quiet rustle of movement began around the cabin. Passengers shifted, adjusted blankets, reached for books, plugged in headphones. The hum of the engine blended into the silence like background noise in a room too tense to feel comfortable. Nia sat perfectly still. Her hands were folded in her lap, her thumbs pressed together so tightly they had turned white. She didn't even realize it until she looked down. She relaxed them slowly, one finger at a time, like someone untying something invisible. The man next to her had pulled out a newspaper. He hadn't said a word since they took off, but Nia could feel him watching her now and then. Brief flickers of curiosity. Not unkind, not cruel, just unsure. She wondered what he thought. Did he think she was just some kid who had wandered into the wrong section? Did he think she was trying to get away with something? Or worse, did he see what happened and decide it was normal enough not to matter? Her jaw clenched. That's what stung the most. Not just the way Cheryl had treated her, but the way no one had spoken up. Not even Riley. Not even the man beside her. Was she expecting too much? She asked herself that question more than she wanted to admit. Maybe people didn't want to get involved. Maybe they were uncomfortable. Maybe they just didn't see what she saw. But she had seen it. She'd felt it. The pause before the words. The doubt in Cheryl's eyes when she looked her up and down. The way her tone shifted when Nia mentioned Seat 2A. Not everyone heard it, but Nia had. And she had heard that same tone before. Not always from strangers. Sometimes in school, sometimes at stores. That tight, polite edge people put on when they don't want to say what they're thinking but say it anyway with their eyes. She didn't want to cry. Not here. Not ever in front of someone like Cheryl. She blinked fast and took a slow breath through her nose. She focused on the small screen in front of her, the map showing their progress across the country. A little plane crawled across the screen like it had nowhere else to be. She reached for the tray table and pulled it down. It clicked into place with a soft snap. A small action, but something about it helped her feel in control again. Her fingers brushed against her phone, still tucked in her hoodie pocket. Nia thought about texting her dad again. She wanted to tell him what happened, every word. But she also didn't want to make him worry. He was working today. He always had early flights when he was on duty. She didn't want him flying distracted. She imagined him in uniform, focused in the cockpit, hands steady, mind clear. She remembered something he once told her when she was 10 and had come home upset after a substitute teacher had mistaken her for a student in the wrong class. "Sometimes people won't see you clearly, baby," he'd said. "But that's not your job to fix. Your job is to stay steady, stay kind. And if it's worth it, set things straight, quiet and strong." She had nodded back then. It sounded good at the time. But it was harder to do now, at 16, sitting in a business class seat she had every right to occupy, feeling like she didn't belong. A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. "Hey," Riley said gently, crouched near her elbow. "I brought you a bottle of water. Sorry for the wait." Nia looked down at the chilled bottle in her hands. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out at first. Then she nodded once, slowly. "Thanks." Riley stayed for a second longer. Her eyes held something close to apology, but she didn't say the words. Maybe she wasn't allowed to. Maybe she didn't know what else to say. Then she stood and walked off toward the galley again. Nia opened the cap and took a long sip. The water was cold and sharp, and it steadied her a little. She placed the bottle carefully on the tray and stared at it. She wasn't sure what was coming next, but something inside her told her to stay still, stay quiet, and let the moment build, just like her father had taught her. "Sometimes," he said, "the most powerful moves are the ones no one sees coming." The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the flight reached cruising altitude. A calm voice over the speaker reminded passengers that electronic devices were now permitted, and meal service would begin shortly. Nia barely registered it. She kept her eyes on the small plastic water bottle in front of her, watching the condensation bead along the sides. She ran her finger through one of the droplets, tracing it in a slow circle. Around her, trays clicked open, murmured conversations resumed, and flight attendants wheeled carts down the aisle. But the quiet in her chest stayed heavy. She felt like a glass someone had filled too quickly, steady on the outside but ready to spill at the edges if nudged even a little. From the corner of her eye, she saw Cheryl coming back. Her red lipstick was still neat, and her posture still straight, but her smile had thinned. She handed a meal to the man beside Nia, complete with a napkin tucked in with care. Cheryl then looked toward Nia, expression neutral, as if the earlier moment hadn't happened at all. "You'll have to wait," she said in the same clipped voice. "We're finishing front rows first." Nia opened her mouth to respond, but then closed it again. She looked down. She wasn't sure what would come out if she spoke. She didn't want to beg for a basic tray of food she had already paid for. She didn't want to say something sharp and be labeled difficult. And she didn't want to pretend like it was fine when it wasn't. The man next to her shifted slightly. "Excuse me," he said to Cheryl, gesturing toward Nia. "She hasn't received anything. Can she at least get a drink?" Cheryl glanced at him with a tight smile. "We'll get to her." It was the kind of response that ended things, politely worded, firm in tone, just enough to let everyone know she was done with the conversation. The man's lips parted slightly, like he wanted to push back, but then he hesitated and turned back to his meal without another word. Nia didn't blame him. She had stopped expecting anyone to fight her battles long ago. Still, her chest ached in a different way now, not just because of Cheryl, but because the silence around her hurt more than the words. It was like standing in a crowded hallway where everyone saw you fall, but no one stopped walking. She turned her face to the window again. Her reflection stared back in the glass, faint and hollow under the cabin lights. For a second, she didn't recognize herself. Her posture was too straight. Her eyes looked older than she remembered. She slid her phone out again just to hold something that felt normal. Her fingers hovered over her dad's name. Then she typed slowly, "Still happening. Just letting you know." She didn't send it. She stared at the screen instead. Her thumb floated over the button, then she deleted it and typed again. "Everything's fine." Deleted. Typed again. "Just checking in." Still not right. She let out a quiet breath and put the phone down. The tray rattled softly as she let it go. Everything inside her felt tight and stretched, like a rubber band pulled to the limit. But she couldn't afford to snap. Not here. She leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes for a moment. She remembered something else her father used to say when she was younger. "There's always someone watching. Maybe not the person who hurt you, but someone sees." At the time, it felt comforting. Right now, it felt like a question. If someone was watching, why weren't they doing anything? Riley passed by again, slower this time. Her eyes met Nia's briefly, and this time, she paused. She didn't say anything, just reached into the cart and quietly set down a covered tray on Nia's table. It wasn't dramatic, no apology, no loud correction, just a small nod, then she moved on. It didn't fix everything, but it felt like something. A whisper of acknowledgement in a room full of silence. Nia lifted the lid slowly. A small meal, a roll, and a cup of fruit. Nothing special. But it meant she didn't have to sit there pretending she wasn't hungry. She picked up the plastic fork and took a bite, not because she wanted to, but because she needed to remind herself that she belonged in that seat, that she didn't need permission to be served, that her presence wasn't up for debate. The food tasted like nothing, but the act of eating it felt like defiance. She didn't know what would happen next, but she felt the shift again, subtle, slow, like the air just before a storm. And this time, she wasn't folding in on herself. She was waiting. The cabin had settled into a rhythm, pages turning, screens glowing, metal utensils gently clinking against plastic trays. It should have felt normal, calm even. But for Nia Chandler, the stillness only made everything feel louder inside. She wasn't tired, but her body felt heavy, like every part of her was trying to hold in something it didn't have the words for. Her food tray sat mostly untouched now, though she had nibbled enough to seem occupied. A couple pieces of melon were still in the cup, the kind that tasted more like water than fruit. Her fork rested at an awkward angle on the tray, but she didn't adjust it. Her eyes kept drifting toward the front of the plane, the curtain that separated the cockpit from the cabin. She wondered if her dad had ever walked through that same aisle during a flight like this. Probably had. He'd been flying for more than 10 years, with a calmness that always made people trust him without asking. Whenever she rode with him on flights when she was younger, passengers used to stop him in terminals just to say he seemed steady. That word always stuck with her. Steady. She wondered what he would do if he were here now, in this seat, watching this unfold. Would he have spoken up already? Would he have called someone, filed a complaint? Part of her wanted to think he'd do all of that. But another part of her, the quieter, more experienced part, knew better. He would have stayed calm. He would have watched, measured, waited. That's what he taught her. You don't always fix it in the moment. Sometimes the real move comes later. After the noise dies down, that's when people listen. Nia shifted in her seat, not because she was uncomfortable physically, but because she was trying to keep her mind from spiraling. She replayed the last hour in her head like a video stuck on repeat. The way Cheryl's face tightened when she showed her ticket, the fake smile that followed, the dismissive way she spoke, the way other passengers kept quiet, eyes low, as if silence was the safest place to hide. She thought about Riley. Kind, quiet Riley. The water bottle, the tray, small gestures offered without words. It wasn't much, but it was more than anyone else had given, and somehow it had mattered. Naya's eyes flicked to the aisle again as she heard Cheryl's voice, bright and airy now, chatting with another passenger in the front row. It sounded like she was joking about something, laughing lightly, as if nothing was wrong. As if the same voice hadn't just been used to brush someone off a few rows back. That was the part that stuck under Nia's skin more than anything. The performance of it. How someone could switch faces so quickly. How she could laugh and flirt and serve wine with a crisp white napkin, while acting like Nia was invisible a few steps away. The space between those two versions of Cheryl, one that smiled for business suits and one that dismissed a teenage girl in a hoodie, felt like a chasm that Nia had learned to recognize far too early in life. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. She turned her head slowly and looked out the window again. Outside, the sky was endless and blue, clouds scattered like slow-moving thoughts. It was quiet out there. Free. Nia pressed her forehead gently against the cool surface of the window. She needed that cold. She needed something to pull her back into her body. The man beside her spoke for the first time since the drink request. "Can I say something?" he asked, low enough that no one else could hear. She turned, cautious. His face was sincere, not forced. He looked like someone who had waited too long to speak and didn't quite know how to begin. "That shouldn't have happened," he said. "Back there." She was out of line. Nia didn't respond right away. Not because she was unsure how she felt, but because she wasn't sure if it mattered anymore. "I know," she said quietly, her voice even. "But she's not new to this job. That means it's not the first time." The man exhaled slowly, nodding. "Probably not." They sat in silence again after that. But this time it wasn't empty. It felt like something had landed in the space between them. A shared awareness, even if it was too late. Then, almost like it was planned, the intercom buzzed. A brief pause. Then the captain's voice came over the speaker. Calm, measured, clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've reached our cruising altitude of 36,000 feet. Smooth weather ahead for the remainder of the flight. Thank you for flying with us." Nia froze. Her eyes didn't move. Her chest rose once, then held. She recognized that voice. And so did Cheryl. A second later, the cockpit door clicked open. The curtain pulled back and Captain Quentin Brooks stepped out. He wore the standard Navy uniform, a gold-trimmed hat tucked under one arm, and calm on his face like it had been stitched there. His gaze swept over the cabin once, brief, controlled. He didn't smile. Then he walked, slow, steady steps, down the aisle toward row 2. And Cheryl finally turned around. Everything in the cabin seemed to stop, though no one said a word. It wasn't silence exactly. It was that weighted kind of quiet where sound still existed but felt muffled, like someone had dropped a blanket over the entire room. Conversations paused. Utensils froze mid-air. Eyes shifted from screens and tray tables to the aisle one by one. Captain Quentin Brooks walked with deliberate calm. His expression was unreadable, but his presence commanded attention. Not just because of the uniform or the authority stitched into his epaulets, but because something in his body language made it clear this wasn't a routine check. Nia felt the first tremor of emotion ripple through her chest. Not fear, not embarrassment, but something else. Something heavier. She knew what was about to happen. She just didn't know how it would land. Or who, exactly, would feel it the hardest. She didn't move. She didn't even blink. Her father stopped right beside her seat. Cheryl turned, her professional smile flickering like a light bulb about to fail. She straightened her posture. "Captain," she said quickly, too brightly. Is everything all right? He didn't look at her. Instead, Quentin Brooks lowered his head slightly and spoke gently, not to Cheryl but to his daughter. You good, Nia? The softness in his tone sliced through the cabin like a warm knife. It was a father's voice, not the one he used over the intercom, not the one that read wind speeds and gave landing times. This was the voice he used when she scraped her knee at 6 years old, when she lost her science fair project to a rainstorm, when she couldn't sleep before her PSATs. It was a voice that belonged to her and only her. Nia nodded once. Her voice didn't come at first. Her throat felt tight. She tried again. Yeah, she said quietly. I'm okay. The man beside her turned slowly, eyes widening as realization set in. Passengers around them leaned slightly into the aisle now, no longer trying to hide their interest. A few gasps were audible. A whispered, "That's her dad," floated from somewhere in the row behind. Cheryl's face began to lose color. Quentin finally turned to her, eyes steady. "Miss," he said evenly, "would you mind stepping into the galley for a moment?" There was no anger in his voice, just weight. Cheryl hesitated, mouth parting slightly. "Of course," she said quickly. "Just let me." She reached for her tray, fumbled it slightly, then handed it off to another attendant without finishing her sentence. She disappeared behind the curtain, movements jerky, hands twitching at her waist like she didn't know where to put them. Nia stared forward, jaw tight. Her heart thudded against her ribs, not from fear but from something deeper, a kind of release she hadn't expected to feel. It wasn't pride, it wasn't revenge. It was quieter than that. Like something inside her had finally stood up straight after sitting curled for too long. Her father remained beside her. His hand reached down, fingers gently brushing her shoulder, grounding her without needing to say anything else. He leaned in slightly, voice low enough that only she could hear. "I saw your message," he said. She turned her head slightly, finally meeting his eyes. "I didn't want to make it a thing," she whispered. "I know," he said. "But it already was." She didn't nod. She didn't look away. She just breathed. Slow, steady, the way he taught her when she got nervous before speeches. She felt the blood in her fingertips again. Passengers were still watching, of course, but this time she didn't care. Let them look. Let them wonder. She had sat through enough. Sometimes dignity meant staying silent. Other times it meant being seen without having to explain yourself. Her father gave her shoulder one last squeeze and then stood straight again. "I'll be back up front," he said quietly. "Text me if anything else happens." Then he walked away. No speech, no scene. Just the quiet authority of a man who had already said everything that needed saying. The curtain swished closed behind him. The quiet in the cabin lingered for a moment longer. Then, slowly, it began to fade. Forks moved again. A baby 2 rows back started to fuss. The world resumed. But something had shifted. Nia felt it in the air, in the posture of the man next to her who now sat a little straighter, in the sideways glance of the woman across the aisle who gave her a small nod, almost like an apology without words. She reached for her phone and opened her dad's last text. "Keep breathing. You're stronger than you think." She read it again, and this time she believed it. For a few long minutes, Nia just sat there, completely still. The tray table in front of her was cleared now, but she hadn't noticed Riley coming by to take it. She had no memory of handing it over, no memory of responding. Her hands were resting in her lap again, fingers loose this time, no longer clenched. But her shoulders hadn't dropped. Her body was holding tension in places she couldn't reach, the kind that settles behind your ribs and under your spine, invisible but loud. The cabin had returned to its low hum, the subtle clinks, the quiet engine, the light shuffle of a passenger heading to the restroom. It should have felt normal again. But normal didn't come back that easily. She could still feel the weight of her father's hand on her shoulder. That single touch had said everything. He hadn't raised his voice, he hadn't embarrassed anyone, and yet his presence had rearranged the room, not through power, but through knowing he had it. and choosing not to throw it. That's what made it louder. Nia leaned her head back against the seat, eyes blinking slow. 1,000 thoughts pressed at her from the inside. She didn't know how to name all of them. Part of her felt safe, finally. Not because anything had changed permanently, but because someone had stood up, someone had noticed, and not just anyone. Her dad, Captain Quentin Brooks, a man respected in the air by people who never even asked about his story. He wore his calm like armor, his competence like a second skin. And today he'd used both to shield her, quietly, carefully. But then came the other part, the one that unsettled her, that made her stomach feel strange, the part that whispered, would they have cared if he wasn't the captain? Would anyone have spoken up? Would Riley have brought the water? Would the passengers have looked at her differently if someone else had walked down that aisle, not in a Navy uniform but in jeans and a hoodie like hers? That's what lingered the most, not the humiliation itself. She could handle that. She had before, she probably would again. It was the reminder that in some spaces, you had to prove who you were before you were treated like you belonged. She turned her head slightly, catching her reflection again in the oval window. Her face looked tired, not just from the flight, but from what it had taken to sit there, to stay calm, to not cry, to not stand up and say, "This isn't okay." She wondered if she should have, if silence, even steady and dignified, was still too quiet for moments like this. "Excuse me," came a voice, low and almost awkward. She turned to see the man next to her again. He looked uncomfortable, but not in a defensive way, more like he was sitting on something he couldn't quite carry anymore. "I just wanted to say," he said. "I should have said something earlier. I saw what happened. I didn't know if it was my place, but I'm sorry." Nia met his eyes. She didn't speak at first. "It's okay," she said after a long pause. "People freeze. It happens." He looked down, ashamed. "That's not an excuse." She didn't respond. Not to that. Instead, she nodded once, then looked forward again. She didn't need an apology. She needed people to stop needing someone in uniform before they took action. But even then, she knew what it had cost him to say it. She didn't dismiss it. A few minutes passed. Then the curtain parted again, this time slowly. Cheryl stepped back into the cabin. Her face had changed. Her perfect red lipstick was still there, but her eyes looked different, like something behind them had cracked, even just a little. She avoided Nia's row at first, focusing on a few remaining passengers in the front. But then her steps faltered. She turned and walked toward Nia. The steps were measured, calculated. When she stopped at Nia's seat, she hesitated. Nia looked up, calm. She didn't speak. She waited. "I wanted to apologize," Cheryl said, voice quieter now but still rehearsed. "If I came across as less than professional earlier, I regret that." Her eyes didn't fully meet Nia's. Nia studied her face for a long moment. She could have said so many things. About the tone, about the looks, about how she hadn't come across as anything, but had been exactly what she appeared to be. But instead she replied, "I heard you. Not I accept your apology. Not it's all right. Just I heard you." Cheryl nodded stiffly, then walked away. The man beside Nia let out a breath like he'd been holding it the entire time. Nia didn't. She'd already let go. It didn't feel like justice. It didn't feel like a victory. But it felt like truth had shown up and refused to move quietly to the back. And that, for today, was enough. She took her phone again and typed something. No edits this time. "I'm okay now. You were right. Quiet doesn't mean weak." Then she put the phone down and looked forward, eyes steady, heart slowly settling into place. The plane coasted smoothly above the clouds, gliding through a band of blue sky so endless it almost felt unreal. Outside the window, sunlight slipped across the wing like melted glass, soft and silent. Inside, the cabin remained dim, passengers lulled into quietness by altitude, warm air, and the soft hum of controlled flight. But for Nia, the silence wasn't restful. It was thick. She sat still in her seat, her back straight but no longer tense. Her body had finally stopped bracing for something. Still, her thoughts remained restless, tangled in the aftershock of the moment that had just passed. Cheryl's apology kept playing in her head, but not because it felt healing, because it didn't. It was careful, rehearsed, legal, not real. It didn't carry the weight of understanding, only the fear of consequence. She'd seen that kind of apology before, in other settings, other spaces. It always came too late, always arrived after something had been taken that couldn't be returned. Respect, when given too late, doesn't land the same. Nia tried to push the thought away, but it clung to her ribs. She closed her eyes briefly, imagining herself far below the plane, walking through her neighborhood, hearing her dad's footsteps beside hers. She used to match her stride to his when she was little. She used to believe adults always had the answers, that grown-ups always did the right thing, that people in uniform always protected. But growing up had taken pieces of that belief away, one small chip at a time. She hadn't become bitter, her father wouldn't let her, but she had learned how to read a room in seconds, how to prepare her expression for when someone questioned her presence, how to carry herself so she didn't get misread, mislabeled, misplaced. It was exhausting, that kind of carrying. And today it had all shown up again. Same judgment, different setting, just higher altitude. She opened her eyes and glanced to the left. Riley was walking slowly through the cabin now, checking on passengers, asking in a low voice if anyone needed anything. Her pace was different than Cheryl's, less performative, more human. When she reached Nia's row, she gave a soft, honest smile. Not pity, not guilt, just kindness. "You all right?" she asked, kneeling slightly to meet her eye level. Not bending down like a superior would, just leveling. Nia nodded. "Yeah," she said, her voice steady this time. "Thanks for earlier." Riley shrugged a little. "Didn't sit right with me," she said. "That kind of thing shouldn't happen. Not ever. And not here." There was a pause. "I've seen it before," Riley added, quieter now. "Usually goes unnoticed. I guess this time it didn't." Nia nodded again, more slowly. "People usually don't say anything." "I know," Riley replied. "They should." Their eyes held for a moment. Then Riley stood. "If you need anything, I'm around," she said gently. "Don't hesitate." And with that, she moved on. Nia turned back to the window, blinking away the burn she hadn't let fall. She wasn't someone who cried easily. But today had felt like too many things pressing into her at once. Pressure from inside, pressure from outside. None of it visible, but it sat under the skin like weight. She thought again about her father's face, the quiet way he'd handled it. No scene, no scolding, no spectacle, just his presence. That had been enough to flip the air in the cabin like a switch. He hadn't said much, but she remembered every word. "I saw your message." It already was. She wondered what he had said to Cheryl behind the curtain. Maybe nothing loud. Maybe just the truth. And maybe the truth, spoken by the right person at the right time, was more powerful than any outburst. That thought stayed with her. Across the aisle, an older woman she hadn't noticed before leaned toward her slightly. Her gray sweater sleeves pushed up, a book resting forgotten in her lap. She didn't speak loudly, just softly, as if speaking through a memory. "You handled that well," she said. Nia turned toward her, surprised. The woman smiled gently. "You didn't raise your voice. You didn't need to. That says a lot more than people think." For a second, Nia didn't know what to say. She wanted to say thank you. She wanted to say, it shouldn't be so hard to be treated fairly. She wanted to say, I'm tired. But instead, she just nodded again. Her voice felt like it was still trying to catch up to her heart. "Thanks," she said quietly. The woman returned to her book. Nia sat back. The world hadn't changed. Cheryl still had her job, the flight continued as planned, and the rest of the cabin was slipping into movie watching and quiet naps. But something inside Nia had shifted. A boundary had been crossed. And this time, it didn't go unanswered. She didn't just survive the moment. She witnessed it. She owned it. And now others had seen it too. The hours in the sky stretched thin. Time always moved differently in the air, measured in drink services and quiet glances at the flight map instead of clocks. Outside the window, the sun had started to dip, softening the clouds with hints of orange and gold. The light painted everything in a glow that made even the airplane cabin feel strangely peaceful. But inside Nia, the stillness hadn't quite returned. Her body had relaxed, sure. Her muscles weren't tight like before. Her shoulders had dropped an inch. But her mind was still working, quietly, sharply, looping through questions, thoughts, and that uneasy feeling that always followed moments like this. She watched the people around her more closely now, not suspiciously, just with different eyes, observing what they had noticed, what they hadn't, how they sat through it, how they moved after. The woman in the gray scarf had gone back to reading, but she kept glancing toward Nia now, like something about her had changed, like she'd become visible. Was it because they knew who her father was now? Would they have noticed her at all if he hadn't walked down that aisle? That question wouldn't leave her alone. It dug into her like a thread caught under a fingernail. She didn't blame her father. She loved him for what he did. But the part that stung wasn't about him. It was about everyone else. About a room full of grown adults who only paid attention once a man in uniform gave them permission to. That kind of truth didn't feel good to know. It sat deep, like a quiet betrayal you couldn't explain to anyone who hadn't lived it. She sighed softly and looked down at her hands. Her fingers were long, steady, her nails short and clean. Her dad always told her they looked like her mom's, though she didn't have many memories of her. Just the stories, the photos, the way her dad would go quiet when he mentioned her name. Nia had grown up on memories she didn't make, but she carried them anyway, carefully, like glass. She imagined what her mom would have said if she'd been here. Maybe something fierce, maybe something soft. Nia leaned her head to the side, resting her cheek against the cool window. The sun caught the edge of her face. She closed her eyes for a moment just to breathe. Behind her lids, she replayed everything. Cheryl's first glance, the disbelief in her voice, the pause before accepting the ticket. She remembered how small she felt in that second, and then how that feeling started to change when Riley handed her the water, when her father touched her shoulder, when the older woman spoke. It hadn't erased what happened, but it had added to it. She wasn't sure yet what to do with that. "Miss Chandler?" The voice was soft, professional. She opened her eyes. A new flight attendant stood in the aisle. Not Cheryl. A man, young, early 30s maybe. He held a white envelope in his hand. Nothing fancy, just airline stationery. "Yes," she said, cautious. "I was asked to give this to you before landing," he said. "It's from Captain Brooks." She blinked. "Oh, thank you." He nodded and moved on. Nia stared at the envelope in her hands for a long second before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of folded paper. Her dad's handwriting, neat, square, unmistakable. "Nia, you did everything right today. I know it didn't feel like it in the moment, but I saw you. I saw how you carried yourself. And I'm proud of you, not because of how I stepped in, but because of how you held your ground before I did. You didn't raise your voice, you didn't shrink, you stayed calm. That takes more strength than most people realize. I wish you didn't have to deal with these moments. I really do. But I also know, if anyone can face them with grace, it's you. We'll talk more when I land. But for now, just breathe. You're not alone. You never were. Dad." She read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and slid it into the front pocket of her hoodie, pressing her palm against it once like sealing it inside her. She didn't cry, but her throat tightened, and her breath caught somewhere between her chest and her stomach. That note, those words, they were everything she hadn't realized she needed to hear today. You're not alone. That was the part that stayed with her, not the apology from Cheryl, not the silence from the passengers, not even the subtle nods and glances that came afterward. It was those three words. Quiet, solid, grounding. She sat back, deeper into her seat. and this time she let her body rest. Not from exhaustion, but from knowing that even when the world didn't make space for her, she carried her own. And someone else, someone who mattered, was watching the whole time. The plane began its gentle descent, and with it came the familiar pressure in Nia's ears, a slow, dull fullness that marked the beginning of the end. The seatbelt sign dinged back on with its soft chime, and flight attendants moved down the aisle with practiced efficiency, checking tray tables, collecting last bits of trash, reminding passengers to buckle up. But inside Nia, the descent felt heavier than gravity. She kept her head turned slightly toward the window, watching the clouds thin out as the earth slowly came into view below. City lights flickered in tiny clusters, like someone had dropped golden beads across a dark rug. Somewhere down there was her aunt's house, her weekend plans, the life she'd intended to walk into with excitement. But now it all felt distant, like the person who boarded this plane wasn't the same one landing. She hadn't expected this flight to change her, not like this. She thought it would just be a routine trip. Boring, maybe. Quiet, hopefully. But instead, she'd been reminded of how easily people misjudge you before they've heard you speak. How quickly respect is rationed when you're young, black, and alone in a space they don't expect you to be. She adjusted the small blanket across her lap, not because she was cold, but because the motion gave her hands something to do. Her fingers tugged at the edge, smoothing the corner over and over again. She was trying to come down with the plane, not just in altitude, but in emotion. The moments had passed. The conflict had settled. But her body hadn't caught up yet. She thought about what would happen after the plane landed. Would Cheryl say anything else? Would she look her in the eye again? Would the passengers go home and tell anyone about what they saw? Or would they file it away, buried under the hundreds of other moments they'd never feel compelled to confront? And what about Riley? Would she get pulled aside for helping? Would she regret it? Would she do it again? Nia's mind spiraled in quiet circles. It wasn't the kind of anger that yelled. It was the kind that whispered late at night when you're brushing your teeth, thinking about something someone said 5 years ago that never left you. The kind that builds slowly in your bones until one day you realize you're carrying the weight of 1,000 small slights, each one too quiet to scream over, but all of them together. Unbearable. A sudden jolt brought her back, just the wheels lowering beneath the plane, but it reminded her that the moment was almost over, or at least this part of it. The man beside her, who had been silent since his earlier apology, turned slightly in his seat. "Would it be all right," he said, his voice low, "if I told my daughter about you?" She blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" He gave a small, self-conscious smile. "She's 12. She's starting to notice things. People. How the world treats her. I think she'd learn something from what you did today." Nia stared at him for a second, unsure how to respond. The idea that her quiet resistance had meant something beyond this flight. It hadn't occurred to her yet. "I guess," she said softly, "if it helps her feel less alone." "Yeah, you can." He nodded, expression sincere. "It will." They didn't say anything else. They didn't have to. The plane dipped lower now. Buildings came into clearer view. The runway stretched in the distance like a long exhale. Nia glanced around one last time. Cheryl stood near the front, buckled in, her face neutral, her eyes forward. She hadn't looked back. Maybe she was hoping the moment would pass like turbulence, brief, uncomfortable, then forgotten. But Nia knew better. Some turbulence stayed with you, long after the seatbelt sign turned off. Riley caught her gaze from a few rows up and gave her the smallest nod. It wasn't forced. It wasn't performative. It felt like truth, the kind that stays. As the wheels touched down with a smooth thud, Nia felt her heart knock once in her chest. Not in fear, not in pain, but with something else. Something closer to strength, a slow, deep rhythm she recognized as her own. Hers, and no one else's. The flight was over, but something real had taken off. The plane rolled down the runway, slowing with a soft roar that rumbled beneath Nia's feet. Her hands stayed folded in her lap, fingers gently curled inwards, not from tension now, but from the quiet of coming back into her body. The cabin buzzed with movement as passengers shifted in their seats, some stretching stiff legs, others leaning forward to gather bags before the seatbelt sign had even turned off. Nia stayed still. The landing hadn't been rough, but the weight of everything she'd carried in the air now felt denser, more present, now that the wheels had touched solid ground. She could feel her heart settling into a different rhythm, no longer guarded, but not fully at peace either. Something in her chest still felt unfinished. The pilot's voice came over the intercom again. This time, it wasn't Quentin Brooks. It was the co-pilot, clear and measured. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Denver. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is turned off. We know you have a choice when you fly, and we thank you for choosing us." A choice. Nia thought about that word. How often people assumed it was that simple. To be seen, to be believed, to be treated equally. As if fairness was something you could select like a seat upgrade. The sign dinged off. Belts clicked. Passengers rose in waves. Bags were tugged from overhead bins. Phones were unlocked. Text messages were checked. The woman with the scarf stretched and gave Nia another quiet look, her expression unreadable but somehow softer than before. A few rows back, someone gave Nia a tight smile. A man. He said nothing. Just looked, then turned away. It was strange being watched like that, not with suspicion anymore, but with something else. Guilt? Respect? Curiosity? She didn't know, and she didn't have the energy to figure it out. Riley passed by one more time, this time checking rows for forgotten items. When she reached Nia, she didn't speak. She just gave a slow, deliberate glance down the aisle, then met Nia's eyes. A small nod. Not one of apology, not even of support. It was a nod that meant I saw it too, and that meant something. "All right, you're good to go," Riley said gently. "Front doors are open." Nia stood slowly, her knees a little stiff. She reached for her small bag under the seat and slung it over one shoulder. As she stepped into the aisle, the man beside her, who hadn't asked her name all flight, spoke one last time. "You changed the room today," he said softly. Nia didn't know how to answer that, so she just held his gaze a moment, then gave him the kind of nod that didn't need words. As she moved toward the front of the cabin, the walk felt longer than usual. Not because of the distance, but because she could feel every eye that followed her steps. She didn't let it rush her. Her spine stayed straight. Her chin held steady. Cheryl stood near the exit, arms crossed loosely, her name tag gleaming in the overhead lights. Her eyes flicked to Nia for the briefest moment. No words, no smile, no second apology. Nia didn't expect one. She paused at the threshold of the plane. Captain Quentin Brooks stood there, just past the door near the jet bridge. Not in full uniform now. His jacket was off and his sleeves were rolled to his elbows. He looked like a dad again, not a pilot. A tired one, but composed. When he saw her, his face softened, not with pity, but with quiet pride. He didn't hug her, not here. But his eyes did something gentler than touch. "You all right?" he asked. Nia nodded. "I will be." He gave the faintest smile. "You already are." And for the first time since boarding, she believed it. They stepped out together side by side into the jet bridge. The door closed behind them with a muted thump, sealing the plane and everything that had happened inside it into a space that now belonged to the past. But as she walked forward, Nia didn't leave it behind completely. She carried it, not as a burden, but as a truth. One she hadn't asked for, but now owned. One she might never fully unpack, but one she would never forget. And maybe one day she'd tell someone else about it. Not for drama, not for praise, but so someone like her, sitting in seat 2 years from now, wouldn't feel alone when the room went quiet. Because she'd know someone had been there before, and had walked out stronger. The walk through the jet bridge was silent except for the soft thuds of their steps and the distant rattle of baggage carts somewhere below. The air was cooler here, less pressurized than the cabin but somehow heavier in its own way. Nia's bag strap pulled at her shoulder, but she didn't adjust it. Her body was still carrying the echo of the flight, the weight of the stairs, the restraint in her voice, the way her father's calm had steadied her more than anything else could have. Her dad walked just a step behind, not crowding her, not leading either. Just present. He didn't ask her to talk. He knew better. Some things needed time to come out, and some things never did. He had taught her the value of silence, but more importantly, the kind that listens. As they stepped into the terminal, the buzz of the airport hit them, people rushing past with roller bags, announcements cutting through overhead speakers, the clatter of shoes against tile. It was jarring after the tight hush of the plane, like re-entering a world that had no idea what she had just lived through in the last few hours. Her aunt would be waiting just outside security. That was the plan. She had texted her before boarding, back when everything still felt normal. Now she wasn't sure what she'd say when they met. "I didn't mean for that to happen," Nia said suddenly, her voice low and a little shaky, as they moved toward the escalator. She wasn't even sure why she said it. It just rose out of her like something that had been pushing upward the entire walk. Her dad glanced at her, eyebrows drawing slightly together. "Mean for what to happen?" "I didn't want to be a problem. I wasn't trying to make it into a thing." She kept her eyes forward. "I just asked for water." He didn't speak right away. They stepped onto the escalator and the motion gave them a strange sense of pause. Movement without walking. Time to think without needing to act. "Nia," he said finally, his voice soft but firm. "You weren't the problem. You never were." She looked down at her shoes. "It just kept happening, and I kept wondering if maybe I was imagining it." "That's exactly how it works," he said, his tone now threaded with quiet sadness. "They make you question your own gut, your own memory, like if you can't prove it, it's not real." Nia nodded slowly, a lump rising in her throat again. "I didn't want to tell you at first," she said. I thought you'd be disappointed, or worried, or that maybe I should have handled it differently." Quentin exhaled through his nose, not sharply, but with the kind of breath that comes from hearing something too familiar. "You handled it exactly how I hoped you would," he said. "You didn't lash out, you didn't shrink. You sat in the discomfort with your back straight. That's strength, Nia. Real strength. The kind people don't see until it makes them uncomfortable." They stepped off the escalator and began walking again. A child ran past them with a stuffed bear dragging behind him. A couple stood to the side, arguing quietly about lost luggage. Life moved on as if nothing had happened. Nia's eyes found the large arrival screens. The city names were a blur. "I just hate that it keeps happening," she said, her voice cracking slightly. Her father nodded. "Me too." They walked another few steps before he spoke again. "You know what I was thinking about when I came down that aisle?" he asked. She glanced at him. "I was thinking about how many times I've flown that same plane, smiled at that same crew. How many times I've told you this job means something. And then I thought about you, sitting there, watching the same people who work beside me treat you like you didn't belong." He stopped walking for a moment. Nia did too. "I wasn't angry because you're my daughter," he said, turning to face her fully. "I was angry because you shouldn't have to be my daughter to get respect." That hit her deep. She looked at him, eyes shimmering but not letting the tears fall. "I know," she whispered. A few feet away, her aunt appeared near the railing, scanning the crowd. She waved when she spotted them, her face lighting up. But Nia didn't wave back just yet. She turned to her dad and asked, "Did you get in trouble?" For stepping out of the cockpit? He gave her a half smile. "Not yet." "Will you?" "I might," he said, then shrugged. "But if they ask me why, I'll tell them the truth, and I'll sleep just fine after." They began walking again, her steps a little lighter now, the ache in her chest a little softer. When they reached her aunt, there were hugs and the kind of small talk people use to mask concern. "How was the flight?" "You must be tired." "We've got dinner at home, your favorite." Nia nodded, answered politely, smiled in the right places. But something in her had changed. She didn't feel like a kid anymore. Not in a bitter way, but in the way that happens when life gives you a moment too sharp to forget. She glanced one last time at the secured doors behind them, where the plane still sat, being cleaned and prepped for the next flight. Same flight number, same seats, same tray tables. But a different story would begin now, for someone else. And maybe, just maybe, because of her, it would go differently. The ride from the airport was quiet at first, the kind of silence that wasn't uncomfortable but carried weight, like everyone in the car was walking across an invisible bridge, unsure if it would hold. Nia sat in the back seat, her cheek pressed lightly against the cold window, watching the Denver skyline blur by. Her aunt Lorraine drove with practiced calm, glancing now and then into the rearview mirror, but never pushing for words. Her dad sat in the passenger seat, seatbelt fastened, hands folded neatly in his lap like they always were when he was thinking. The city lights flickered across the windshield, casting soft patterns on the dashboard. Outside, everything looked ordinary. Street signs, fast food joints, families walking with grocery bags. But inside the car, Nia felt like her skin was holding in something too big for her chest. The weight of what happened wasn't in the yelling, because there hadn't been any. It wasn't in a scene or a dramatic ending. It was in the quiet parts, the glances, the pause, the way she had to prove she belonged in that seat, the way no one had said anything until a man in a uniform stepped out and made them see her. Even now, hours later, it still clung to her like humidity, not soaking wet, but enough to be uncomfortable in places no one else could see. Her phone buzzed gently in her lap. It was a message from Riley, just a simple text. "Glad you're okay, I was watching." Nia stared at the screen for a long moment, then typed back, "Thanks for saying something. That mattered more than you think." She hit send and exhaled. From the front seat, Lorraine spoke for the first time. "You hungry? I made the sweet potato bake you like. And we've got that cornbread you and your dad always finish before dinner even starts." Nia smiled faintly, her cheek still on the glass. "Sounds good." "You don't have to talk about it, sweetheart," Lorraine added, her voice low. "But if you want to, I'll listen." Nia nodded, but her voice didn't come. Not yet. They pulled into the driveway and she felt the shift again. A new space, a different rhythm. A place that felt like home, even if it wasn't hers all the way. Lorraine's porch light was on, casting a warm glow over the walkway. Wind chimes clinked gently by the door. Something about the sound soothed her, like it had when she was little. Inside, the house smelled like cinnamon and roasted garlic. Familiar. Software grounding. Her aunt went straight to the kitchen, pulling out plates and humming under her breath. Her dad stepped into the hallway to take a quick work call, his voice low and steady like it always was when he talked to crew. And Nia stood there, in the middle of the living room, unsure of where to set her bag. She finally dropped it next to the couch and sat down. The couch cushion gave under her like it always had, as if it remembered her. She stared at the coffee table for a long moment, then finally spoke. "Why did she look at me like that?" Her aunt paused in the kitchen. "Who?" "The flight attendant. Cheryl. She looked at me like I didn't make sense." Lorraine came out of the kitchen slowly, wiping her hands on a towel. "She didn't look at you, baby. She looked at who she thought you were. There's a difference. But she made me feel small, like I didn't belong, even after I showed her my ticket. That's not your reflection. That's her lens." Nia looked down at her lap. It still felt like mine. Lorraine sat beside her, not too close, not too far. "I know it did. It always does. That's what makes it so heavy." There was a pause. The wind outside rustled faintly against the windows. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm just imagining it," Nia whispered. "Maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe I make it a bigger deal than it is." Lorraine reached for her hand. "That's what they want you to think. So you stay quiet. So you keep wondering. But baby, the truth is, if it feels wrong, it usually is." They sat there in silence, her aunt's hand firm and steady around hers. After a while, her dad came back into the room, the call finished. He leaned against the doorway and just watched them for a second. His daughter, his sister. 2 generations holding something too old and too familiar. "I told the airline," he said quietly. "Filed a report. I didn't use your name unless you want me to." Nia looked up. Her chest rose and fell once. "You can leave it in. I'm not ashamed." His expression shifted. Just slightly, but Nia saw it. The pride, the ache, the love. "All right," he said. "It's in." Later they ate dinner at the kitchen table, laughter slowly returning between bites. Not forced, earned. Lorraine told stories about her neighbor's broken fence and a squirrel that had made itself king of the yard. Nia smiled. Her dad even chuckled once, shaking his head like he couldn't believe it. And when Nia went to bed that night, lying beneath the soft blanket her aunt always kept folded at the foot of the guest bed, she felt something strange settle in her chest. Not peace, not completely, but a steadiness, the kind her father always carried. And maybe now she was learning to carry it too. Morning came quietly. The first light bled through the thin curtains of her aunt's guest room, painting the walls in soft grays and blues. Nia lay on her back, eyes open, already awake before the sun finished rising. The room smelled faintly of lavender from the diffuser Lorraine always kept on the dresser. Outside, a few birds chirped, early, half-formed calls that hadn't yet become full songs. The city beyond the window hadn't come alive yet, but it would soon. She didn't move. Her body was still, cocooned in blankets, but her mind was full. The events of the flight came back in pieces, not as a whole. Like broken glass, she was still trying to arrange into a mirror. Cheryl's face. The pause before she said, "You must mean 12A." The way the man next to her looked down, unsure whether to speak. The way her father's hand on her shoulder had quieted a storm inside her without needing to stop the storm around her. And that note he sent. "You're stronger than you think." Nia blinked, her eyes moist now, not from pain but from the strange relief that came with being seen, truly seen, by someone who mattered. Not because he fixed it, but because he understood it without her needing to explain. That was a different kind of healing. She slowly sat up, brushing the blanket back. Her phone was on the nightstand beside her, still plugged in. A few new notifications had appeared overnight. A message from a classmate just asking when she'd be back. A text from Riley again. "Just so you know, I spoke to my manager. About Cheryl. I don't know what they'll do, but I told the truth." Nia stared at the message for a long moment. She typed out a reply. "Thank you. Even if nothing changes, you did the right thing." She sat with that a while. It didn't feel like enough, but it felt real. Downstairs, she heard the soft clatter of pans. Lorraine was already making breakfast. Probably her usual Saturday pancakes. Her dad's voice drifted in faintly too, low and steady. On the phone again, probably with dispatch or another pilot. He'd go back to work today. The world would keep moving, but she wouldn't walk into it the same. She took a shower slowly, washing her face longer than usual, brushing her hair with more care. Not because she was trying to be strong, but because she was strong, and she had earned the right to move slowly, to choose what came next. When she came down to the kitchen, her father was sitting at the table with a mug in hand. He looked up and smiled. "Sleep all right?" She nodded. "Better than I expected." He reached over and placed a napkin-wrapped envelope in front of her. No name on it, just folded with purpose. "What's that?" she asked. "Your return ticket," he said. "I upgraded it to first class again. Same seat." She raised an eyebrow. "Seriously?" You don't run from spaces where you belong, he said simply. You sit in them, even if people don't think you should. She looked at the envelope, then back at him. You coming with me? Nope. That one's yours to own. A slow breath left her lungs. She didn't know what she expected, but she hadn't expected that. He pushed the mug aside. You're going to be in a lot of rooms like that one, Nia. Maybe not in the air, maybe in school, work, meetings. But the feeling will be the same, and sometimes there won't be anyone walking out of the cockpit to back you up. She nodded slowly. But by then, he continued, you'll know you don't need them to. They sat in silence for a beat, Lorraine flipping pancakes behind them, humming faintly. Nia stared at the envelope again. She wasn't ready to board that flight yet, but she would be. She thought about the girl who walked onto that last plane with her hoodie sleeves pulled over her palms, quiet and unsure. And she thought about the girl who walked off it, silent, steady, still shaken, but taller. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't demanded. But the world had shifted around her anyway, slightly, not all at once. Not enough to fix it, but enough to leave a mark. And that mattered. Later that afternoon, as her aunt dropped her off at a bookstore down the street, Nia walked in alone. No father, no crowd, no uniform trailing behind her. Just her. A girl with her head held high. A girl who no longer needed to explain why she belonged. If you felt this story, please give it a like and share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear them. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories coming soon.